The first thing Mark Reinhardt noticed wasn't the silence, though the absence of the gate's low, reassuring hum was a void in the morning air. But the smell, the rich, loamy scent of the Pacific Northwest, of wet cedar and decaying fir needles, was suddenly, violently overpowered by the acrid, chemical tang of a brand-new master lock. It was bolted through a hasp that hadn't been there the night before, cold and chrome against the weathered gray of the gate he had built with his own hands. His gate, on his property. His name was on the deed, carved into the very land beneath his feet. But the lock belonged to the Talon Ridge Homeowners Association. His fingers, calloused from a lifetime of hard work, traced the cold, unforgiving steel. This wasn't just a lock. It was a declaration of war, a tremor, not of fear, but of a deep seismic fury started somewhere in his core. 20 years as an Army combat engineer had taught him two things: how to build fortifications, and, more importantly, how to breach them. He'd defused IEDs in Fallujah, built bridges under fire in the Hindu Kush, and now he was locked out of his own 5-acre slice of peace by a homeowners association run by a woman whose greatest tactical achievement was probably organizing a neighborhood potluck. He could see it from here, his cabin. A modest A-frame of honey-colored pine nestled in a clearing at the end of a 300-yard gravel drive. It was the one place on Earth that didn't smell of diesel fuel and cordite. It smelled of wood smoke and his late wife's lilac bushes, which he'd painstakingly kept alive for a decade since the cancer took her. The memory of her, of the life they'd planned here, was a physical ache, a weight in his chest that this lock was now trying to invalidate. A silver Lincoln Navigator, polished to a blinding sheen, crunched slowly up the gravel road behind him. It didn't need to announce itself. The pretentious purr of its engine and the cloud of dust it kicked up were signature enough. The window slid down with a soft electric whir, revealing the meticulously curated face of Deborah Van Houten, president of the Talon Ridge HOA. She was 60, dressed in a crisp white linen shirt that was entirely impractical for the woods, her blonde hair a helmet of perfection. She smelled of expensive perfume and authority she hadn't earned. "Mark?" she said, her voice a syrupy blend of faux sympathy and gleaming steel. "I see you've noticed our little upgrade." "My gate, Deborah," he said, his voice low, a gravelly rumble that promised an avalanche. "My property line starts 20 feet back from here." "You're trespassing," she offered a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "According to the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, which you signed, dear, the HOA maintains a right-of-way and architectural control over all entry points to properties within Talon Ridge. This gate is non-compliant. It's rustic." She said the word like it was a synonym for leprous. "It keeps the elk out. It served its purpose for 10 years. Well, its purpose has changed." Her eyes flicked over his shoulder, toward his cabin, with a gaze that felt like an appraiser's. The Architectural Committee voted unanimously. This eyesore is to be replaced with a standardized wrought-iron, electronically monitored gate. The lock is to ensure no further unapproved alterations are made while the work order is processed. Mark took a step closer to the car, the gravel grinding under his boot. The smell of her perfume was cloying, nauseating. "You take this lock off. Now!" "Or what, Mark?" Her smile widened, a predator finally showing its teeth. "You'll call the police?" "I already have. Sheriff's deputy is a dear friend of the HOA. He understands the importance of upholding community standards. Or you'll cut it. That would be destruction of association property. A $5,000 fine. We can lien your property for that. We can foreclose." The words hung in the damp air, a threat as cold and hard as the lock itself. Foreclose. They could actually try to take his home over a gate, over a fine. The sheer, staggering injustice of it was a punch to the gut. This wasn't about a gate. This was about him. He was the last holdout, the only parcel in Talon Ridge that hadn't been subjugated into her perfect, soulless vision of mountain living. His chickens, his vegetable garden, his rustic cabin, they were splinters in her eye. She wouldn't rest until he was sanitized or gone. He remembered the day he signed the CC&Rs, a stack of papers shoved at him during closing. He'd just buried Sarah. His world was ashes. He'd scrawled his name without reading, a mere formality to get the keys to the one place that felt like a refuge. That signature, signed in a fog of grief, was the weapon she was now using to eviscerate his peace. He didn't say it aloud, but the thought screamed in his mind. Governing documents are a contract, but they are not a suicide pact. They are subordinate to state property law. And under Washington state law, RCW 6438.020, an HOA cannot arbitrarily restrict access to a property owner's fee-simple land. They can have architectural control, but they cannot imprison you outside of it. The work order, Mark said, his voice dangerously calm. Let me see it. Deborah's smile tightened. It's with the committee. There is no work order, Deborah. There's no committee vote. You saw a chance to strong-arm me, and you took it. This is just you. Her facade cracked for a microsecond, a flicker of surprise that he'd called her bluff. It was instantly replaced by a colder, harder mask. The lock stays. You have 24 hours to acknowledge the violation and agree to the new gate specifications. Otherwise, the fines begin accruing. Have a blessed day, Mark. The window slid up, sealing her in her air-conditioned tank, and the navigator executed a slow, triumphant K-turn before rolling back down the hill, leaving him alone with the smell of its exhaust and the gleaming new lock on his old gate. He didn't cut the lock. That's what she wanted. An excuse to escalate. A combat engineer doesn't charge the machine gun nest. He finds a way to make the nest irrelevant. He turned and walked back to his truck, a plan already forming, cold and precise. He had a set of bolt cutters in his shed, but he wouldn't use them. Not yet. Instead, he drove the 30 minutes into the sleepy county seat of Pine Creek. The courthouse smelled of old paper, lemon-scented polish, and dust. He spent hours there, buried in leather-bound ledgers and microfiche machines, his fingers tracing the lines of his property's history. He found what he was looking for in a dusty plat map from 1972, before Talon Ridge was even a glimmer in a developer's eye. The original land grant. The legal description of his parcel was unequivocal. His property line didn't start 20 feet past the gate. It started 50 feet past it. The gravel easement for the road, the land the gate was bolted to, it was his, all of it. The HOA had a right-of-way for ingress and egress, a legal permission to use the road. That was all. They had no more right to install a lock on his gate than they did to install one on his front door. A grim smile touched his lips. Deborah Van Houten hadn't just locked a gate. She had trespassed, and she had installed a fixture on his property without his permission. She had, in her arrogant overreach, handed him a weapon. He didn't go home. He went to the hardware store. He bought a new lock, identical to the one she had put on his gate, a shiny new master lock. He also bought a high-resolution, weatherproof trail camera. And then he went to a different shed, on a different piece of property owned by an old army buddy, and he got out his welding rig. The next morning, before the sun had burned the dew off the ferns, he was at his gate. The HOA's lock was still there, a shiny badge of tyranny. He ignored it. He climbed the cedar post he'd treated and set himself a decade ago. He mounted the camera high up, angled perfectly to cover the gate and the road in both directions. He made sure the little red recording light was off, making it virtually invisible. He wanted no warning. Then he took the new lock he'd bought. He held it in his hand for a moment, feeling its weight. This wasn't just a lock. It was the first move in a counteroffensive. He reached through the bars of his own gate and clicked it shut on the opposite side. through the same hasp Deborah's crew had installed. His hasp on his gate, on his property. Now there were two locks. The outside one was the HOA's, locking him out. The inside one was his, locking them out. A perfect, beautiful stalemate. A trap. He stood back, the smell of fresh coffee from his thermos mixing with the morning mist. He looked at the two locks. To anyone from the HOA, it would look like their lock was still in place, unchallenged. They would have no idea there was a second one behind it. They would think they still held the keys to his kingdom. He knew they would be back. People like Deborah couldn't help themselves. Their arrogance was a compulsion. They had to keep pushing, to prove their dominance. They would come to check on their prize, to gloat, or to install their ugly new gate. And when they did, they would find their access denied by a lock they didn't own and couldn't cut. Their only choice would be to cut the HOA's own lock to get to his, an act of destruction he would have on crystal-clear video. They'd be violating their own rules, destroying their own so-called property, and providing him with irrefutable evidence of their trespass. He took a long sip of coffee. The woods were quiet, waiting. The trap was set. All he had to do was wait for the mouse to get hungry. 2 days passed. The forest held its breath. The trail camera, a silent sentinel, captured nothing but a curious doe and the swaying of pine boughs. The tension was a physical thing, a low-grade hum in Mark's veins, a constant background awareness that felt eerily familiar from his time downrange. This was the waiting, the calm before the contact. The break came on the third morning, not with Deborah's Lincoln, but with a beat-up white pickup truck with Talon Ridge HOA-approved vendor magnetically slapped on its door. 2 men in work boots got out. One, burly and bearded, carried a clipboard. The other, younger, chewed on a toothpick and hefted a post-hole digger. "See?" the bearded one said, his voice picked up clear as a bell by the hidden microphone. "Told you. Van Houten said it'd be unlocked. Crew's supposed to start on the new footings for the Iron Gate today." He reached for the HOA's master lock, expecting it to open. It didn't. He jiggled it. Nothing. He cursed, low and ugly. "She gave me the wrong code. Typical. Randy, get the bolt cutters from the truck." Randy obliged, returning with a heavy pair of cutters. The sharp, metallic snap of the HOA's lock being severed echoed through the quiet woods. The bearded man tossed the ruined lock into the dirt. Destruction of HOA property, on camera, and pushed on the gate. It swung open a bare 2 inches before stopping dead, brought up short by the second lock. The one they couldn't see. The one on the inside? "What the hell?" the man muttered, sticking his face between the bars. His eyes widened as he saw the second lock. "Son of a bitch!" The homeowner double-locked it from the inside. "Can we cut it?" Randy asked. "It's on the other side, idiot. Our cutters won't fit through the bars. We'd have to cut the whole damn hasp off. And that's probably his property." Van Houten said not to touch his property, just to dig on the easement. They stood there, stumped, 2 pawns suddenly realizing the Queen had sent them on a suicide mission. They argued for a few minutes, their frustration mounting, before finally getting back in their truck and rumbling away. Leaving the gate slightly ajar, the HOA's lock destroyed in the gravel, and their entire conversation recorded in perfect, high-definition video. Mark watched the footage from his laptop inside the cabin, a slow smile spreading across his face. Phase 1 was a success. He had them. They'd taken the bait. They'd destroyed their own property and had documented their intent to perform unapproved construction. He saved the video file in 3 different locations. He labeled it Evidence 01. He knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Deborah wouldn't take this setback lying down. She would escalate. She would come herself. He was right. The white truck hadn't been gone an hour when the familiar silver Navigator came prowling back up the road. This time Deborah wasn't alone. A sheriff's deputy cruiser followed close behind, its light bar dark, but its presence an unmistakable threat. Deborah launched out of her SUV before it had fully stopped, her face a mask of fury. She stormed up to the gate, saw the cut lock on the ground, and saw her own access blocked by the hidden second lock. Her composure shattered. That vandal!" she shrieked, her voice losing all its cultured syrup, becoming shrill and raw. "He destroyed our lock, officer, you see? You see the damage!" The deputy, a man in his 50s with a tired face and a name badge that read Wilkins, approached slowly. He looked at the cut lock on the ground. He peered at the gate, noticing the second lock on the inside. He looked unimpressed. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a dry drawl, "it appears your guys cut your own lock." Because he obviously changed the code. "He provoked them. This is his doing." She was pointing a trembling, manicured finger toward Mark's cabin. It was Mark's cue. He emerged from the tree line, not from the direction of his cabin, but from the side, as if he'd been out for a walk. He held a steaming mug of coffee. He looked calm. "Something I can help you with, Deputy. Deborah." He nodded at her, the picture of polite confusion. "Mr. Reinhardt," Deputy Wilkins said, "Ms. Van Houten here is alleging you vandalized association property." He gestured to the cut lock on the ground. Mark took a slow sip of his coffee. The rich, nutty aroma seemed to amplify Deborah's rage. "That's interesting," he said, his voice even. "I've been down at the courthouse all morning, Deputy, researching property lines. Found some fascinating old maps. It seems there's some confusion about where my land actually starts." He let that hang in the air. He saw a flicker of uncertainty in Deborah's eyes. She hadn't done her homework. She'd assumed. "The lock is irrelevant," she snapped, recovering. "He has violated the covenants. He has installed an unapproved, non-compliant second lock. I demand you cite him for trespassing and vandalism." Deputy Wilkins sighed, the sound of a man who had to deal with HOA drama far too often. "Ma'am, is this your gate or his?" It's a common access point. It's HOA controlled." Mark decided it was time. He looked at the deputy, his tone respectful, factual. "Deputy, under Washington state law, an easement for ingress and egress grants a right to pass over land, not a right to possess or improve it. The CC&Rs might give the HOA architectural approval, but that doesn't transfer ownership. This gate is on my property, attached to my posts, which are on my land. I have the plat map from 1972, right here in my truck if you'd like to see it. She's the one who trespassed to install her lock. And then her contractors trespassed again to cut it off." Deputy Wilkins looked from Mark's calm, factual demeanor to Deborah's sputtering fury. He looked at the cut lock on the ground, cut by her guys. He looked at the gate, clearly on what he was now starting to believe was Mark's property. "This sounds like a civil matter, ma'am," Wilkins said, his mind made up. "A property line dispute. You all need to take this to a lawyer, not call 911. He tipped his hat to Mark. "You have a good day, sir." "You can't be serious," Deborah screeched as the deputy walked back to his cruiser. "He's a criminal. I will have your badge." The cruiser door slammed shut, and the car rolled away, leaving Deborah alone, humiliated, and utterly defeated on the wrong side of Mark's gate. She turned her venomous gaze on him. The mask was gone completely now, revealing the petty, furious core of her. "This isn't over, Reinhardt," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I will bury you in fines. I will lien your property. I will take your home, and I will burn that cabin to the ground and sow the earth with salt so nothing ever grows here again." She was unhinged. It was a beautiful, terrifying sight. Mark just took another sip of his coffee. He said nothing. He simply looked at her through the bars of the gate he owned, the gate she was locked out of. She spun on her heel, marched to her SUV, and peeled out, spraying gravel behind her. The woods were quiet again. The confrontation was over. He had won this battle. He had the law, the facts, and the video evidence on his side. He had humiliated the HOA president in front of law enforcement. But as he listened to the sound of her engine fade away, replaced by the gentle sigh of the wind in the tall pines, a cold dread trickled down his spine. He had won the skirmish, but he had unleashed the beast. Deborah's threat wasn't just rage, it was a promise. She wouldn't play fair anymore. She would come at him sideways, through the bylaws, through the courts, through anonymous smears. She would use the very system designed to protect homeowners to destroy one. He was a combat engineer. He was prepared for a direct assault. But how do you fortify against a poison that flows through the mail slot? How do you defuse a bomb that's disguised as a certified letter from a law firm? He looked down at the cut lock lying in the dirt. It was just a piece of metal. The real lock was the power she thought she had, the fear she instilled, and he had just publicly picked it. Her next move wouldn't be another lock. It would be something quieter, something darker. The trap had been sprung, but the bigger predator was still out there, wounded, angry, and now infinitely more dangerous. He turned and walked back toward his cabin, the weight of the coming storm settling on his shoulders. The fight had just begun, and the next volley wouldn't be a lock. It would be a lawyer. The silence after Deborah's departure was heavier than before, thick with the promise of retaliation. The sharp, clean scent of the cut lock's exposed steel still hung in the air, a metallic testament to the first battle won. Mark stood there for a long time, listening to the forest reclaim its soundscape, the chatter of a squirrel, the distant cry of a hawk, the whisper of the wind through the cedar boughs. It was a peace that felt fragile now, borrowed. He collected the severed lock from the gravel. It was cool and heavy in his palm, a trophy from a vanquished foe. But as he turned it over, the triumph curdled into a cold, familiar dread. This wasn't Fallujah, where the enemy wore a uniform and fought with recognizable weapons. This was Talon Ridge. The weapons were certified letters and bureaucratic fine print. The battlefield was a spreadsheet of fines, and the enemy was a woman who had just been publicly humiliated. A cornered animal was always the most dangerous. He didn't have to wait long. The next morning, the sound that broke the peace wasn't a Lincoln Navigator, but the distinct, authoritative rumble of a U.S. Postal Service truck grinding its way up the hill. It was a sound that didn't belong here. The mailboxes were a mile down at the community entrance. They never delivered to the door. Mark watched from his window as the truck stopped at his gate. The carrier, a woman with a weary expression, shoved a thick, legal-sized envelope through the bars, letting it fall to the gravel before driving off. The act felt intentionally dismissive, like feeding a prisoner. He walked down the drive, the gravel crunching ominously under his boots. The envelope lay there, white and malignant against the dark earth. He picked it up. It was addressed to him from the law firm of Holloway, Crest and Van Houten. Van Houten. The name was a slap. The return address was a sleek office building in downtown Seattle. This wasn't from the HOA's local lawyer. This was from the big leagues. Deborah had called in the family artillery. The paper inside was thick, expensive linen stock. The letterhead was embossed, the typeface brutally professional. It wasn't a fine notice. It was a formal notice of covenant violation and demand for cure, citing 17 separate breaches of the Talon Ridge CC&Rs. He read it standing there, the morning sun warming the paper in his hands. Yet he felt a cold chill seeping into his bones. It was a masterpiece of legalistic pettiness. Violation 4. Unapproved livestock. 3 hens. Breed unspecified. Violation 7. Non-compliant. Vegetation. Unsightly proliferation of native blackberry bushes on TDT, northwestern property line. Violation 11. Storage of unpermitted. Materials. A stack of untreated firewood exceeding 2 cord limit and not housed in an approved shed. Violation 14. Structure exhibiting significant aesthetic decay, weathering on south-facing cabin siding. It went on and on. The vegetable garden was too large and commercial in appearance. His truck, a 10-year-old Ford F-150 with a minor dent in the tailgate, was an unapproved vehicle that had to be stored out of sight. But the one that made the blood drain from his face was the last one. Violation 17. Unauthorized memorial site. A grouping of non-indigenous lilac bushes, constituting an unapproved landscape feature and potential biohazard. Sarah's lilacs. She'd planted them the first spring they'd moved in, a symbol of the life they were building. He'd nursed them, talked to them, pruned them with a tenderness he usually reserved for cleaning his rifle. They were all he had left of her voice, her laughter, the way she'd hummed while gardening. And this document, this piece of paper from a stranger in a skyscraper, was calling them a biohazard. It was a violation so deeply personal, so cruelly calculated, that it stole the air from his lungs. The cure was detailed with surgical precision. Remove the hens, uproot the blackberries, tear down the woodpile, repaint the entire cabin with HOA-approved colors from a specified vendor, and remove the unauthorized memorial site. The total cost of the fines for these violations, which had begun accruing the moment the letter was sent, was $42,850. The deadline for compliance was 72 hours. After that, the law firm would initiate lien and foreclosure proceedings. The paper trembled in his hand. This was it. This was her real attack. Not a lock, not a shouting match. A financial and legal drone strike designed to vaporize his savings, his spirit, and his home from 1,000 miles away. The sheer, overwhelming weight of it pressed down on him. How do you fight an army of lawyers? How do you prove your wife's memory isn't a biohazard? He walked back to the cabin on legs that felt numb. The familiar smells of home, pine sol, coffee, the faint, sweet scent of the lilacs drifting through the window, now felt like the smells of a prison under siege. He spread the letter on his rough-hewn dining table, a piece of corporate warfare on a surface he'd sanded and oiled himself. He had 72 hours, 3 days to stop a freight train with his bare hands. His first instinct was to call the county sheriff. Deputy Wilkins had been reasonable, but as he read the letter again, he knew it was useless. This wasn't a trespass. This was a civil contract dispute. The sheriff would just tell him to get a lawyer he couldn't afford, especially not one who could go toe-to-toe with a firm like Holloway, Crest and Van Houten. Panic started to lick at the edges of his mind. He was an engineer, a soldier. He dealt with physical problems. He could build a bridge, defuse a bomb, fortify a position. He couldn't de-weaponize a clause in a covenant about firewood. Then his training kicked in. When you are outgunned, outmanned, and surrounded, you do not attack the enemy's strength. You find their weakness. You bypass their fortifications. You make them fight on your terms. He needed intelligence. He needed to understand the weapon being used against him. He drove back to the county courthouse, back to the smell of dust and old paper. This time, he didn't go to the plat map room. He went to the records department and asked for the complete official filing for the Talon Ridge Homeowners Association. The clerk brought him a heavy 3-ring binder. It was their governing documents, the Articles of Incorporation, the bylaws, the CC&Rs. This was their constitution. This was the source of their power. He found a quiet carrel and began to read. Not like a homeowner skimming for rules, but like a soldier studying the blueprints of an enemy bunker, looking for the structural flaws, the weak welds, the forgotten ventilation shafts. He read about meeting quorums, voting procedures, architectural review committees. It was dry, soul-crushing text. But then, buried in a section titled Enforcement and Penalties, he found it. His first loophole, a tiny crack in their armor. The CC&Rs stated that before any fine could be levied, The homeowner had to be granted a good faith opportunity to be heard before the Architectural Review Committee. The notice from the lawyer had given him 72 hours to comply, but it had made no mention of this hearing. They had skipped their own mandated procedure. They had violated their own rules in their rush to punish him. It was a procedural error, a small one. But in the law, procedure was everything. It was the difference between a valid order and an unlawful one. It was the pin in the grenade. He photocopied the page, a surge of adrenaline cutting through the numbness. He had a point of attack. It was small, but it was something. On his way out, he ran into Mrs. Gable, the elderly, bird-like clerk who'd worked there for 40 years. She remembered him from his previous visits. "Find what you needed, Mr. Reinhardt?" she asked, her glasses perched on the end of her nose. "Getting there," he said, holding up the photocopy. "The HOA is trying to foreclose on me over some lilac bushes." Her kindly face darkened. "Tellenridge? That Van Houten woman?" She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're not the first. The Henderson family down on Blue Jay Way? They had a swing set for their grandkids. Unapproved structure. Fined them into oblivion. They had to sell. It was a shame. The news was a gut punch. He wasn't an outlier. He was a target in a pattern. Deborah had done this before. She had a system. Who else?" Mark asked, his voice low. She looked around nervously. "I shouldn't say, but you might talk to Ben Carter over on the West Ridge. He fought them for a year over a shed. He might still have the paperwork." Ben Carter. The name was a thread. He thanked Mrs. Gable and left, the photocopy in his pocket feeling like a live round. Ben Carter's place was a mirror image of his own struggle. His property was neat, but showed signs of a war of attrition. A faded "For Sale by Owner" sign leaning against a tree. A sense of weary exhaustion. Ben himself was a man in his 60s, with the stooped shoulders of someone who had been beaten down by something he couldn't see. He was wary at first, but when Mark mentioned Deborah's name and the lawyer's letter, the floodgates opened. He invited Mark in, the smell of stale coffee and defeat hanging in the air. "They got me with the shed," Ben said, his voice raspy. "Then it was the color of my shutters. Then it was my dog barking. The fines? They never stop. It's death by 1,000 paper cuts. They want my land. They want to combine my lot with the neighbors and build some $1 million mountain contemporary monstrosity." He showed Mark a drawer full of letters from Holloway, Crest, and Van Houten. The tactics were identical. Overwhelm, intimidate, bankrupt. "How did you fight it?" Mark asked. "I didn't," Ben said, his eyes hollow. "I'm out of fight. I'm listing it next week. They win." He looked at Mark, a flicker of pity in his gaze. "You can't beat them, son. They have all the money, all the lawyers. They make the rules, and they break them whenever they want. It's a rigged game." The visit was a plunge into ice water. This was the end game. This was what happened. Good people were ground into dust by the relentless, impersonal machinery of it. He drove home, Ben's despair a heavy weight in the truck with him. His 72 hours were almost half gone. The panic returned, colder this time. He had a procedural error. But would it be enough? They'd just fix the mistake and send another letter. He needed something bigger. He needed a weapon they didn't see coming. He thought about what Mrs. Gable had said. They want the land. It was never about the lilacs or the gate. It was about the asset. The land, an idea, dark and audacious, began to form. It was a Hail Mary pass, a tactic so far outside the conventional rules of engagement that it just might work. It was born from the absolute certainty that playing their game by their rules meant certain defeat. He went to his old footlocker, the one that smelled of gun oil and camo paint and a dozen different deserts. He dug past his old uniforms and manuals until his fingers found a small, waterproof pouch. Inside was not a weapon, but a memory. A stack of letters from his grandfather, a man who'd been a land surveyor and a passionate amateur historian. He'd written to Mark during his first deployment, telling him stories of the old days to take his mind off the war. One story came back to him now, vividly. His grandfather had written about the miner's loophole, an old, mostly forgotten state statute regarding land use and water rights that had been used to settle property disputes in the territorial days. It was obscure, arcane, and had probably been superseded by 100 newer laws. But what if it hadn't? He spent the rest of the night and all the next day online, buried in the labyrinthine archives of Washington state law. He cross-referenced statutes, read legislative histories, and chased footnotes until his eyes burned. The smell of cold pizza and stale coffee filled the cabin. He was no lawyer, but he was an expert researcher, trained to find the critical flaw in any system. And then, deep in the night, he found it. It wasn't the miner's loophole, but something else, something better. Washington state, like many states, has a right-to-farm law designed to protect agricultural operations from nuisance lawsuits brought by new neighbors who move in next door and complain about the smells and sounds of farming. But the law had a specific, powerful clause. If a property had been used for agricultural purposes before the enactment of restrictive covenants, those covenants could not prohibit the continuation of that agricultural use. It was a grandfather clause of immense power. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. He scrambled back to the county records. He looked up the original subdivision plat for Talon Ridge. It was filed in 1998. Then, his fingers trembling with a frantic energy, he went back to the old maps, the aerial photographs. He found one from 1975. The land was clear. His 5 acres, and Ben Carter's, and the Hendersons, it was all part of a single, larger parcel. And there, in the clearing where his cabin now stood, was a clear, unmistakable pattern of furrows. A garden. A big one. The parcel had been owned by a man named Elias Finch. Mark searched the name. Elias Finch. Deceased. No family. But a search of old county fair records revealed that an E. Finch had won blue ribbons for his vegetables every year from 1965 to 1985. This wasn't just a garden. It was a documented, award-winning agricultural operation. It predated the HOA covenants by over 30 years. The lilacs weren't just a memorial. They were part of the landscaping for that old farm. The blackberry bushes, they grew along the old property line. His hens? They were poultry, absolutely an agricultural use. His firewood? He heated his home with it, a sustainable harvest of his own land. He wasn't violating the covenants. The covenants, when applied to his historical agricultural use, were void. The revelation was like a thunderclap. He had not just a defense. He had an offense, a nuclear option. He spent what was left of the night drafting a response. It wasn't from Mark Reinhardt, the homeowner. It was from Mark Reinhardt, the operator of the Finch Family Farm, a historical agricultural enterprise. He cited the right to farm law, RCW 748305, and attached the aerial photo and the county fair records. He stated that all cited violations were protected, pre-existing agricultural activities. He demanded the immediate and permanent withdrawal of all fines and a formal cessation of all harassment regarding these activities. He didn't send it to the law firm. He sent it, via certified mail, to every single member of the Talon Ridge HOA board, and he carbon copied the Washington State Department of Agriculture. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to expose them. He wanted to make their overreach a liability for every homeowner they served. He dropped the letters in the post office box at 4:58 p.m., 2 hours before his deadline expired. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples. He felt a grim, exhausted satisfaction. He had fought back. He had used their own weapon, paper, against them. He drove home, the tension of the last 3 days finally beginning to ease. He had done it. He had found the flaw in the Death Star. He walked into his quiet cabin, the smell of home now smelling like victory. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey, toasting Sarah, toasting Elias Finch, toasting the sheer, beautiful power of a loophole. He was halfway through the glass when his phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from a number he didn't recognize. No words, just a single, chilling image. It was a photograph, taken from the road, through the trees. A perfectly framed shot of Sarah's lilac bushes, and lying mangled and broken among the blooms, its white feathers stained dark, was one of his hens. Its neck had been snapped. The glass of whiskey slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor, the sharp, peaty smell of the liquor flooding the room. The image burned on his screen. This wasn't a lawyer's letter. This wasn't a fine. This was a promise, a threat, a declaration that the rules were over. They weren't going to fight him with paper anymore. The war had just gone hot. The smell of spilled whiskey, sharp and peaty, warred with the coppery scent of blood that seemed to bloom in Mark's imagination from the phone screen. The image was a punch to the throat, a violation so profound it turned the familiar shadows of his cabin into something menacing. They hadn't just killed a chicken. They had desecrated a shrine. They had thrown a part of his life, a piece of his carefully maintained peace, into the dirt of his wife's memory. The cold, methodical part of his brain, the combat engineer, immediately took inventory. The photo's angle was from the road, through the trees. They'd been here, watching, while he was at the post office. This was a message sent the moment they knew he was home. They were still watching. The other part of him, the widower, the man who had built this life from grief, wanted to scream. He wanted to get in his truck, drive to Deborah's perfectly appointed mansion, and reduce it to kindling. But that's what she wanted. She wanted him enraged, impulsive, criminal. She wanted to justify the full weight of the law coming down on him. He took a long, shuddering breath, the air tasting of alcohol and rage. He did not break. He bent and began picking up the shards of glass from his floor, each piece a sharp, clear metaphor for the fragility of the peace he'd fought for. The systematic motion calmed him. Wipe, pick up, dispose, assess, plan. He went outside, the night air cool on his skin. He didn't go to the lilacs, not yet. He went to the trail camera he'd mounted on the gatepost. He downloaded the footage onto his laptop, his heart a dull drum in his chest. The white truck had come and gone. Deborah's navigator had made a slow pass earlier in the afternoon. But around the time the text was sent, there was nothing. No vehicles. Whoever had done this had parked down the road and walked in, staying out of the camera's frame. They knew it was there. They were adapting. He walked down to the lilac grove, a flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive dark. The smell hit him first. The sweet, heavy perfume of the blooms, now undercut by the faint, foul scent of death. There she was, poor Clucky, discarded like trash among the roots. The sight, so much more visceral than the photo, ignited a fresh wave of fury. This was no longer a legal dispute. This was terrorism. He buried her deep in the woods, away from Sarah's garden, saying a small, quiet apology for not protecting her. As he shoveled dirt, his plan solidified. It was no longer about defense. It was about total, absolute victory. It was about dissolution. The next morning, the Silver Navigator returned. Deborah emerged, not with a deputy, but with a man in a cheap suit carrying a clipboard. The lawyer's letter had been received. She was here to inspect his compliance. She looked triumphant, her eyes scanning for signs of his surrender. The missing hens, the disturbed earth where the lilacs should have been ripped out. She saw nothing changed. Her smile was vicious. "Time's up, Reinhardt. I see you've chosen the hard way." Mark stood silently on his side of the gate, holding a single sheet of paper. He didn't speak. He simply held it up to the bars for her to read. It was the aerial photo of Elias Finch's farm from 1975, with the furrows clearly visible. Below it was a printout of the Washington State Right to Farm statute, with the key section highlighted. And below that, a single typed sentence: "All further communications regarding pre-existing agricultural activities are to be directed to the Washington State Department of Agriculture." Any attempt to fine, lien, or foreclose upon this property for these activities will be considered malicious prosecution and will be met with a counterclaim for damages. The man with the clipboard, some junior associate from the law firm, squinted at it. His confidence wilted. He leaned in and whispered frantically to Deborah, "Ms. Van Houten, this changes things. This statute is very powerful. If he can prove this—" "Prove what?" she snapped, her voice losing its cultured edge. "That some dead man grew tomatoes 50 years ago? This is a pathetic stunt." But the doubt was there, a crack in her armor. She hadn't done her homework. Her arrogance had blinded her to the history beneath her feet. "The burden of proof is on us to disprove it if he asserts it in court," the lawyer whispered, more urgently. "And with the Department of Agriculture copied in, this could get very messy, very public." "I don't care about messy," she shrieked, turning her fury on the hapless lawyer. "I want him gone. Use the other thing. Use it now." The lawyer looked profoundly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I strongly advise—" "Do it," she screamed, her face mottled with rage. The lawyer sighed, reached into his briefcase, and pulled out another envelope. This one wasn't fancy. It was a standard business envelope. He slid it through the gate. "Mr. Reinhardt, this is a formal notice of the emergency meeting of the Talon Ridge HOA Board, convened for tonight at 7 p.m. at the clubhouse. You are required to attend. Failure to attend will be taken as a waiver of your right to be heard." Mark took the envelope. "On what grounds is this emergency meeting convened?" The lawyer wouldn't meet his eyes. "The board will discuss ongoing issues of non-compliance." "What issues?" Mark's voice was a low rumble. Deborah shoved the lawyer aside, her face pressed against the cold steel of the gate bars. "We're dissolving your property, Reinhardt. We're invoking the clause, the one for blighted, uncooperative properties. We're taking a vote to force the sale of your land for the betterment of the community. Your little farm loophole won't save you from this." Mark almost smiled. He knew this clause. He'd read it in the binder. It was the HOA's nuclear option, rarely used, almost impossible to enforce. It allowed the board to force the sale of a property if it could be proven the owner was causing irreparable harm to the community's property values. It was a subjective, draconian power, and using it so blatantly, so quickly after losing the legal argument, was an act of sheer, desperate insanity. She was panicking. She was showing him her last card, and it was a joker. "I'll be there," Mark said, his voice calm. He turned and walked back to his cabin, leaving her sputtering in impotent rage. He could feel her hatred like a physical heat on his back. He had 6 hours. He didn't spend it preparing a speech. He spent it on the phone. His first call wasn't to a lawyer. It was to Ben Carter. "Ben, it's Mark Reinhardt. They're calling an emergency meeting tonight to force the sale of my property." A long, weary sigh on the other end. "I told you, son. You can't fight them." "You're wrong," Mark said, his voice iron. "I found a way, but I need your help. I need you to be there tonight. And I need you to call the Hendersons. I need you to tell them to be there too. It's time to stop losing." He heard a faint spark of something in Ben's silence. Not hope, but a flicker of defiance. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to give them exactly what they want," Mark said. A vote. He made 2 more calls. One to a number at the State Attorney General's office, Consumer Protection Division. The other to a reporter at the Seattle Times who had written a series on housing issues. He gave them the same pitch. An HOA is holding an emergency meeting to illegally seize a property using a manufactured blight clause, less than 24 hours after the homeowner invoked right to farm protections. He promised them a show. At 6:55 p.m., Mark Reinhardt walked into the Talon Ridge clubhouse. The air was thick with the smell of cheap coffee, perfume, and tension. The room was all glass and polished pine, a monument to Deborah's taste. She sat at the head of a long table, flanked by 4 other board members, all of whom looked deeply uncomfortable. The junior lawyer sat to her side, looking at his hands. In the audience seats, there were a handful of Deborah's sycophants. But in the back, sitting stiffly, were Ben Carter, a middle-aged couple he assumed were the Hendersons, and a few other faces he recognized from his courthouse research. Other homeowners who had been ground down by fines and threats. And in the very back, a man in a nondescript windbreaker and a woman with a notebook sat quietly. Observing, Deborah gavelled the meeting to order, her eyes blazing with triumph. "We are here to address the existential threat Mark Reinhardt poses to our community, our standards and our property values." She launched into a diatribe, listing his crimes, the gate, the hens, the rat-infested woodpile, the unauthorized junkyard of his truck. She presented the lawyer's letters as evidence of his intransigence. She was performing for her supporters, her voice rising in theatrical outrage. Mark just sat, hands folded, waiting. Finally, she pointed a trembling finger at him. "We have given you every chance, Mr. Reinhardt. You have spat in the face of this community. Therefore, I move that the board vote to invoke Article 12, Section C, and initiate proceedings for the forced sale of the Reinhardt property to dissolve the blight upon Talon Ridge." She looked at her board. "Do I have a second?" The room was silent. One board member, an older man named Mr. Gunderson, cleared his throat. "Deborah, this is extreme. Perhaps we should—" "I second the motion." A shrill woman next to Deborah chirped. "All in favor?" Deborah said, her voice tight. Before the vote could be called, Mark stood up. "Point of order, Madam President." She glared at him. "You do not have the floor. According to Robert's Rules of Order, which your bylaws adopt, a member of the community has a right to speak to a motion before a vote is called." She fumed, but the junior lawyer nodded nervously. "He's correct, Ms. Van Houten." She waved a dismissive hand. "Fine. Speak. It won't change anything." Mark walked to the front of the room. He didn't look at the board. He turned and looked at the homeowners in the back. "At Ben. At the Hendersons. My name is Mark Reinhardt. I live on 5 acres on the West Ridge. Deborah calls it a blight. I call it my home." His voice was clear and carried easily in the silent room. "But this isn't about my home. This is about yours." He held up the stack of photocopies he'd brought. "I've been down at the courthouse. It's amazing what you can find. Like the fact that the HOA's operating budget has a line item for legal fees that has tripled in the last 2 years. Who do you think pays for that? You do. You're paying for the lawyers who are writing you letters." He looked at a man in the front row. "Mr. Evans, they fined you $800 for a dock on your pond you didn't know needed a permit, didn't they?" The man's eyes widened in shock. He nodded, almost imperceptibly. Mark turned to a woman. "Mrs. Lee, your solar panels were held up for 9 months by the Architectural Committee. How much did that delay cost you?" She stared at him, her mouth a tight line. He walked toward the back, handing out photocopies. They were records of fines, liens, all public record. The Hendersons, a swing set. Ben Carter, a shed. Me, some lilac bushes and a few chickens. This isn't about standards. This is about revenue. And it's about land. Deborah Van Houten and her family real estate company, Van Houten Properties, has purchased every single lot that has been foreclosed on or forced into sale by this HOA in the last 5 years. They're not preserving a community. They're conducting a hostile takeover. The room erupted in murmurs. Board members shifted in their seats. Deborah shot to her feet. "This is slander. Those are private transactions. They're public record." Mark's voice boomed over the din, silencing it. He turned to the man in the windbreaker. "Isn't that right?" The man stood up, flashing a badge. "State Attorney General's office. We've been investigating complaints about predatory practices in several HOAs for months. We'd be very interested in seeing the minutes of this meeting and the financial records that show a correlation between fines and related party land acquisitions." The reporter stood up, her phone now recording. "Maureen Gable, Seattle Times. Ms. Van Houten Can you explain why your family's company is the primary beneficiary of HOA foreclosure actions? Deborah was white as a ghost. Her board was now staring at her in horror, pulling their hands back from her as if she were radioactive. "This meeting is adjourned," she screeched, grabbing her gavel. "No," Mr. Gunderson said, his voice firm. He stood up. "It is not." He looked at the room, at his neighbors' betrayed faces. "I call for a new motion, a vote of no confidence in President Van Houten, and I move we immediately dismiss all fines and violations against Mr. Reinhardt, and open an independent audit of all HOA finances and legal actions for the past 5 years." The second was immediate. It came from 3 board members at once. The vote was unanimous. Deborah was removed on the spot. She stood there, utterly alone, her empire of pettiness crumbling around her. The look on her face wasn't just shock. It was utter obliteration. She had been exposed, not just as a bully, but as a corrupt one. She grabbed her purse and fled the room, the eyes of her former subjects burning into her back. The meeting dissolved into chaos, but it was a chaos of liberation. Homeowners surrounded Mark, shaking his hand, asking questions, their voices a mix of anger and relief. Ben Carter clapped a hand on his shoulder, his eyes shining with a light that hadn't been there before. "You did it, son. You actually did it." Mark just nodded. He felt drained. The victory was sweet, but it was tempered by the image of a dead chicken in the lilacs. Some victories cost more than others. In the weeks that followed, the dominoes fell quickly. The state investigation expanded. The newspaper story ran on the front page. Deborah Van Houten and her family were facing not just civil lawsuits from a dozen homeowners, but criminal charges of fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. The HOA was effectively dissolved, its power broken, replaced by a voluntary neighborhood association with strictly limited powers. One afternoon, Mark was splitting firewood, the clean, sharp smell of fresh-cut cedar filling the air. The rhythmic thwack of the maul was a meditation. He heard a car on the road, but didn't look up. He'd taken down the gate. The posts remained, a monument to the war, but the path was open. The car stopped. It was a beat-up sedan. Ben Carter got out, followed by the Hendersons. They stood there for a moment, looking uncertain. "Heard you were the man to see about starting a proper farmers' cooperative," Ben said, a shy smile on his face. "Might have a few folks interested. Seems this is farm country after all." Mark leaned on his maul, looking at them. He saw the hope, tentative but real. He looked past them, at his land, at Sarah's lilacs, blooming more fiercely than ever. The scent was everywhere, a sweet, victorious perfume. He nodded. "Yeah," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "Yeah, it is." He wasn't just a homeowner anymore. He was a precedent. He was a warning. And as the sun warmed his back and his neighbors talked about heirloom tomatoes and compost, Mark Reinhardt knew the truest peace wasn't the absence of conflict. It was the peace that came after you'd won the war you never wanted to fight, and could finally go back to tending your garden. "The lock they used to try to break me is rusting in a jar on my porch. The gate is gone. The road is open. And every time the wind blows, it carries the smell of lilacs, not litigation. They thought they held all the keys. They never understood that some things, your home, your memory, your right to be left the hell alone, can't be locked away. If you're fighting a war against a bully who thinks the rules don't apply to them, dig deeper than the fine print. Find the history, find the truth, and never, ever be afraid to swing the maul. Your story could be next. What's the most outrageous HOA rule you've ever faced? Drop it in the comments. Let's see how many of us are out here, holding the line. And if you believe no one is above the law, hit subscribe. This was just one battle. The war to take our homes back is just beginning.